In this lesson, I want to discuss the request lifecycle events and how they're important to the MVC framework. After our application starts and the HTTP modules are initialized, the rest of the application request events fire. These are the events that will fire every time a new request is made. Begin request is the first event that fires for every new request, followed by a few events related to authentication and authorization. Various HTTP modules can respond to these events depending on how your application is configured, but an in-depth look at security is beyond the scope of this course. The resolve request cache and post-resolve request cache events are obviously related to caching, but we are interested in them for a different reason. Post-resolve request cache is actually the event that the URL routing module responds to when it selects an HTTP handler for the request. This can be kind of confusing because the events immediately following handler selection are called map request handler and post map request handler. These names imply the handler is chosen during these two events, but technically it is not. This is kind of a quirk with ASP.NET because certain versions of IIS do not support the map request handler event. So the way I like to think about this is that the URL routing module sort of chooses the handler behind the scenes, and map request handler just kind of officially states that the handler is about to be chosen. I just want you to be aware of what's technically going on behind the scenes though. Regardless of the odd behavior of these events, the interesting point is that the handler does not immediately execute after it's chosen. Instead, a few events fire that are related to state. This is a good example of how the life of a request is not just a direct call to MVC. There are many components working together here. Our MVC handler actually executes during the pre and post request handler execute events. We will look more at this handler later on, but it's between these two events that most of the MVC framework executes. A controller is built, an action method is selected, and all the other MVC concepts you're familiar with run their course. After the MVC handler has executed, other events fire that deal with more of the supporting services like caching and logging. The details of these topics are again outside the focus of this course, but we will discuss them in a little bit more detail in later lessons. After all these events have fired, the response that was generated by MVC is finally sent back to the browser. Remember, most of these events interact with HTTP modules, which hook into the overall lifecycle to provide data, as well as consume data to update their state. So as you can see, there is a lot going on in an ASP.NET application. For this course, we want to continue to focus on understanding the overall sequence of events as they relate to the MVC framework. That way, when we dive into the inner workings of MVC itself later on, you'll understand the context in which all of this is executing. In the next lesson, let's plug into these events through code just to prove out the concepts that we've been discussing. Along the way, we'll also talk about when and why you might want to use some of these specific events.